Greetings, ENH 295 students. This is a video lecture to accompany the PowerPoint about the literary analysis and what a literary analysis is. For this class to start, we're going to be using the elements of soapstone, which would be the speaker, occasion, audience, purpose, subject, and tone. Which lend themselves to that acronym soapstone. Those are the elements that we use when we are analyzing how a piece is written. And you can use it to analyze visual media as well, or visual pieces as well. In this class, we will be analyzing literature. So we're going to start with that piece of the soapstone, and then we're going to be looking at how literary elements lend themselves to that rhetorical stance that the author's taking. So I wanted to start with that soapstone, but then I also wanted to walk you through the PowerPoint on literary analysis. So we'll go ahead and get started with that. So if you open up the PowerPoint, it might look funny, there might be slides with text underneath, but you can go ahead and click View in PowerPoint, and then I'll take you right to the proper view for the slides, and you can work through each one. So we'll start with the first one. What is a literary analysis? Well, it's literary, it's analysis, it's an argument. Essentially, whenever you are creating a literary analysis, you are stating a claim, you're making an argument, you're interpreting the text for what you believe it stands for. You may also include information on from secondary sources in your analysis to support your points. So the reason why it's considered a literary analysis is because you're looking at the different components that make up the literature, and then you're looking at, okay, so how do those elements contribute to what the author is trying to say? Some literary concepts that, and if you move to slide 4, some literary concepts that we might associate with analysis, there are the basics. And you can see right there on the left-hand side, you have the basics. You have the plot, the setting, narration, point of view, characterization. And essentially, whenever we're talking about literary analysis, that's where people start for analyzing literature. You might look at how does the plot contribute to the overall theme of the book, or how does the setting contribute to the context of the book, or how do the characters contribute? Perhaps it's an allegory. You know, how do the characters contribute to the allegorical nature of the book? Then you have symbol, metaphor. Those are the basic fundamental, I guess you could say, pieces of a literary analysis. Now, if you look on the right-hand side, you're going to see other key concepts: historical context, social political context, ideology, multiple voices within the piece of literature. And then you can also start to bring in critical literary theory or different critical pieces and compare and contrast those. Now, for our class, we're going to start with the left-hand side, but of course, you're always welcome to challenge yourself and move into the right-hand side in terms of analysis if you would like. I will be providing you with a literary terms handout that has some terms that you will be able to use. Also, there are collections of literary criticism and theory available in the library. So the concept behind a literary analysis is essentially looking at how the different pieces of the, and I've said this more than once, but you're looking at how. You're not looking at what it's about. You've been summarizing pieces probably since elementary school. So the literary analysis and analysis piece moves beyond just the knowledge. In an analysis, you are taking the information that's there, and you're looking at the different components of how it's put together, and you're making an assumption or you're making a claim about how that's done. What literary elements are used to help the author convey that point. And so there's different ways that you can do that. One of the ways is to look at those various components of how the individual work relate together. So is there symbolism in terms of the character? Is that done deliberately? Is there a certain tone to the novel? Are there themes that run throughout? Are there any motifs that are present? Another way to analyze literature is to look at two literary works. And typically, when we're looking at comparative literature, we're looking at either two pieces of work that are in the same genre that may have similar themes, or we're looking at two pieces of work that are by the same author. And then beyond that, if you wanted to bring in two or more pieces, then you could start to take a look at maybe certain pieces written at a specific time in history and look at the different angles in terms of which when that's written. One piece that's famous for this would be the Grimm's fairy tales, and taking a look at how those fairy tales are conveyed, our perception of them, and then of course how Disney has reinvented some of them. Okay. So then we move into how is it an argument? Essentially, you are in charge of your argument. You're in charge of your interpretation of the text. And as long as you have textual support from the text, then that's what you want. You can bring in secondary sources, however, to do that. Now, once we get to slide 8, there's different thesis statements that are written there, and they're all written about Moby Dick by Herman Melville. And there's several there. There's 4. And if we were doing this face to face, I'd have you reading them out loud, and then we'd be voting on the one that we thought was the best. But let's just go through and walk through and take a look at each one. So the first one says Moby Dick is about the problem of evil. And when we read this, we might say, okay, who cares? So what? It's about the problem of evil. That doesn't give you any specifics, doesn't give you anywhere to really move. It's very broad, it's very vague, and really if you wanted to talk about the problem of evil in Moby Dick, you could probably write a book about it, or you could teach a whole semester class about that, although I don't think I'd want to take that class. The next thesis says Moby Dick is boring and pointless. Okay, so maybe you think it is. That's fine. That's an opinion, though. It's not a claim, and there's distinctly a difference between the two. So we could say Moby Dick is boring and pointless, but how are we going to analyze that? What are we going to do? Are we going to take long-winded passages from the text and talk about how boring they are? That sounds like a pretty boring essay to me. Next we have Moby Dick is about a big white whale. Okay, so what? We know that, and again, this one doesn't lend itself to analysis, and certainly it doesn't show any depth or desire for depth in terms of interpretation of the piece. And when we get to the 4th thesis, which I'm hoping you were like, oh yeah, definitely number 4 is the best one, we have the use of whiteness in Moby Dick illustrates the uncertainty about the meaning of life that Ishmael expresses throughout the novel. And of course, we know the first words of Moby Dick are "Call me Ishmael," the narrator. But we have whiteness, which is a symbol. And then we have the definition here where it's talking about how it illustrates this theme of uncertainty about life and how it emanates throughout the novel. So when we are writing our thesis statements for our journal entries in this class, I want you to frame them so that there is analysis present and that you have a place to go to support your points. Which leads us into our next slide. How do you support the thesis? So once you write that thesis, what's next? You can use direct quotes, and typically you're going to be using direct quotes. You're going to be using specific text because it's intentional. You want to use the exact words the author wrote. On occasion, you might use summary if you're talking about a whole chapter or maybe the book as a whole. Paraphrase sometimes, but I would say with literary analysis, either you're using summary or you're using direct quotes. You can bring in other critics' opinions, historical social context, of course, and then any quotes that you integrate, I would expect that you, and we'll get into integrating them, but I would expect that you would cite them using MLA format, Modern Language Association. Because this is a literature class, we will be using MLA format. So I keep saying secondary sources. What does that mean in terms of your analysis? A secondary source would be a book, an article, something you find in the library that supports the discussion that you're having about the piece that you've read. Now, in terms of secondary sources, I'll say that the hottest, latest novel that's been published isn't going to have a lot of secondary sources on it because it's new. So if you start looking at literature that's considered classic, that was printed 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 25 years ago, you're going to find a lot more criticism on those pieces than you would a novel that's released yesterday. Secondary sources, there's a lot of resources in the library on secondary sources for literary criticism. And then remember that your secondary sources are there for support. In the past, I've had students go to sites like SparkNotes or CliffsNotes or schmoop.com and take information that they thought was analysis straight from the website and try to copy and paste it in. While those sites are good to look at to get a better idea if you're reading a particularly difficult novel, I would not suggest integrating direct quotes from those types of sites. Really try to interpret it on your own. And then remember, those secondary sources are merely for support. They're not in place of your own ideas. So to recap, an overview in terms of a literary analysis, the goal is for you to be able to take different pieces, look at different pieces of how something is written, and look at the parts and think about how they contribute to the whole piece, make a claim about it, and appropriately integrate secondary sources when possible. That's it for lesson 1. Let me know if you have any questions.